The palace of the High Lycan throne was a place of cold, polished marble and shadows that stretched like claws across the floors. But in the nursery of the crown prince, the silence wasn't cold. It was agonizing. Little Julian Blackwood, the heir to the most powerful bloodline in the territory, lay curled in a fetal position upon his silk sheets, his breathing coming in jagged, wheezing hitches. He was barely 7, yet his small fur-covered frame was gaunt, his golden eyes dimmed by a persistent, throbbing misery that no royal healer had been able to diagnose. Hello everyone. It is so wonderful to have you back for another journey into the heart of the kingdom. Whether you're watching from the bustling streets of Lagos or a quiet corner of the world, I hope you're doing well. If you're new here, welcome to our family. Please hit that subscribe button and join us. We have so many more secrets to uncover together. And for those of you who have been with us, thank you. Your support keeps these stories alive. Where are you tuning in from today? Let me know in the comments below. Elena Thorne, the newest maid assigned to the royal wing, stood at the edge of the nursery, her hands folded neatly in her apron. She had been warned, don't speak unless spoken to, don't look at the king in the eyes, and whatever you do, stay away from the prince's personal belongings. But as the boy let out a sharp, involuntary yelp, his small body spasming against the velvet, Elena's heart broke. This wasn't just a sickness. This was a torment. She crossed the room, her footsteps silent on the expensive rug. The child was shivering, his thick auburn-tinted fur matted with a cold sweat. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed the hair back from his forehead, looking for a fever. But as her hand moved down to the nape of his neck, she felt something sharp, hard, and utterly wrong. It was buried deep, hidden expertly beneath the thickest patch of his fur near the spine. As she carefully parted the hair, her breath hitched. It was a jagged, obsidian splinter, pulsating with a faint, necrotic violet light. Her mind raced. That splinter wasn't just lodged there. It was anchored into the child's nervous system, slowly draining his life force and causing excruciating, targeted pain. It was a dark, forbidden binding. As she stared at the artifact, the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a curse of nature. This was an assassination attempt happening right under the king's nose. The door to the nursery groaned open. Elena didn't have time to pull her hand away. The shadow of a man, tall, imposing, and radiating a dangerous, predatory power, fell across the floor. It was King Julian himself, his eyes glowing with a warning amber light. "What are you doing to my son?" he growled, his voice a low, threatening rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Elena stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't tell him she had found the source of his son's pain, not yet. She didn't know who she could trust in this palace of whispers. But as the king stepped closer, she realized that the very person who was supposed to be the boy's protector might be the one who had hired the person who put that splinter there. If the king found out, would he kill her for meddling, or would he realize that his own house was rotting from the inside out? The tension in the nursery was so thick it felt like the very air had crystallized. King Julian stood over the bed, his presence, a mix of absolute authority and primal, unchecked instinct, filling the small room. His eyes, typically a molten amber, were dark with a mixture of grief and mounting, dangerous suspicion. He looked not like a sovereign but like a wounded predator guarding its dying kin. I was only checking his fever, Your Majesty," Elena said, her voice steadying through sheer force of will. She kept her hands behind her back, her fingers still tingling from the cold, oily touch of the obsidian shard. She knew that to reveal the truth now would be to signal her own death warrant. Whoever had placed that object inside the prince was someone powerful, someone with access to his private quarters and the skill to bypass the royal guards. "He is fading," the king murmured, his gaze shifting from Elena to his son. The vulnerability in his voice was a crack in the armor, a glimpse into the heart of a man who ruled over thousands but couldn't save the one person who mattered. "The healers say it is a lingering curse from the Great War. They say it is inevitable." Elena didn't look at the king, she looked at the boy. Little Julian's breaths were shallow, his small claws digging into the velvet of his quilt. She felt a surge of protectiveness that defied all logic. She was a peasant, a maid, a ghost in the halls of power, but she possessed something the king and his high-born advisors lacked, an understanding of the forgotten dark arts. She had grown up in the slums of the outer district, where the curse was often just a fancy word for poison or sabotage. As the king turned his back, pacing toward the balcony, Elena risked a glance at the shadows in the corner of the room. A woman stood there, Lady Serafina, the king's primary advisor and the self-appointed guardian of the palace staff. Serafina was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper eyes, her gaze tracing Elena's every movement with a cold, predatory intelligence. Serafina had been the one to hire Elena, and now Elena realized with a jolt of terror she was watching. Elena needed an ally, but in this palace, every face was a mask. She remembered the faces of the other maids, women who walked with their heads bowed and their secrets buried deep. Among them was Mina, a quiet girl from the kitchens who knew every back passage and every rumor that drifted through the servants' vents. Mina was the only one who didn't look at the prince with pity, but with a strange, watchful fear. "You are dismissed for the evening, Elena," Serafina said, her voice smooth as glass, cutting through the silence. "The royal healers will take the watch from here. The prince requires silence." Elena hesitated. To leave was to abandon the boy to his slow, agonizing end. To stay was to invite suspicion. She bowed, her skirts swishing softly, and backed toward the door. As she passed Serafina, she caught the faint, sickly sweet scent of nightshade and rotting lilies on the lady's silk robes, the same scent that had lingered on the obsidian shard in the boy's neck. Her mind raced as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors back to the servants' quarters. She had been hired for a reason. She wasn't just a maid, she was being used as a pawn or perhaps a scapegoat. She sat on her cot, the stone walls of the palace feeling like they were closing in. She needed to know who had the power to place that shard. It required blood affinity, a deep knowledge of the palace wards, and the clinical cruelty to keep a child alive through the agony of the binding. She thought of the king's brother, the embittered Duke Vane, who had been banished to the northern borders years ago but still held influence among the court's inner circle. Or perhaps it was someone closer, someone who gained everything from the king's distraction and the heir's decline. Elena pulled a hidden diary from beneath her mattress. It wasn't a diary of her life, it was a record of the court's movements. She had been observing for weeks, long before she was hired, waiting for a chance to expose the rot. But now the stakes were personal. If she didn't find a way to extract that splinter without alerting the assailant, the boy wouldn't survive the night. The palace was a tomb of hushed whispers and flickering torches as the clock struck midnight. Elena knew the royal guard changed shifts at this hour, leaving a fleeting gap in the surveillance of the nursery. She moved through the servants' corridor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't have the luxury of fear. Little Julian was slipping away, his life force being siphoned by that obsidian parasite. She reached the nursery door. With a trembling hand, she produced a skeleton key Mina had pressed into her palm earlier that evening. The lock clicked, a sound like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. She slipped inside. The prince was pale, his breathing now a ragged, shallow rasp. Elena didn't hesitate. She knelt by the bed, her fingers finding the matted patch of fur at his neck. She pulled a small vial of silver salt solution and a pair of sterilized iron tweezers from her apron. She began the extraction. It was slow, delicate work. The moment the iron touched the obsidian, the shard pulsed with a violent violet light, lashing out with a psychic jolt that sent Elena reeling. She bit her lip until it bled, refusing to cry out. If she lost control, the shard would shatter, and the jagged pieces would bury themselves permanently into the boy's spinal column. "Just a little further," she whispered, her voice a fragile prayer. As she pulled, the shadow in the room shifted. A figure detached itself from the gloom, not a guard but Lady Serafina. Her eyes were wide, not with surprise, but with a terrifying, calculated rage. She held a curved dagger that shimmered with the same necrotic light as the splinter. "You are far more than a simple maid, aren't you?" Serafina hissed, stepping into the moonlight. "You're a scavenger. A thief of secrets." Elena didn't let go of the tweezers. "I'm the one who's going to stop you," she retorted, her eyes locked on Serafina's. "Stop me? Child, I am the one who has held this kingdom together while the king plays at war. If the pup dies, the bloodline ends and the duke rises to claim the throne. A duke who knows how to reward loyalty." Serafina lunged, the dagger aimed for Elena's throat. Elena rolled, shielding the prince with her own body, and in the movement she gave the tweezers a final violent yank. The shard came free, but as it left the boy's skin, It exploded into a cloud of toxic violet smoke. The nursery was instantly filled with the suffocating miasma. Julian let out a piercing, unearthly howl, a sound no child should be able to make, as the binding broke. The door to the nursery exploded inward. King Julian stood there, his eyes glowing like two suns of pure, golden fury. He saw the smoke, he saw the dying boy, and he saw Serafina standing over Elena with a drawn blade. "Serafina," the king roared, his voice shaking the stone walls. "What have you done?" Serafina didn't retreat. She smiled, her expression one of cold triumph. "The king is too late," she whispered. The smoke began to coalesce, forming into a swirling, jagged silhouette of a creature, a dark manifestation of the binding ritual. It wasn't just a trap. It was a summoner's bridge. The king's own palace had been turned into a gateway for something far worse than a traitor. The nursery, once a sanctuary of soft linens and moonlight, had transformed into a crucible of raw, violet terror. The swirling miasma coalesced into a jagged, multi-limbed constructive shadow, the Null Wolf, a creature born from the necrotic energy of the splinter Elena had just ripped from the prince's spine. King Julian didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't even look at Elena as he surged past her, his body shifting in a sickening, fluid transformation. He became a towering, silver-furred beast, his muscles bulging with enough force to crack the marble floor. He lunged at the shadow construct, his silver-sheathed claws raking through the haze, but the creature was made of the same void stuff as the splinter. Julian's claws passed harmlessly through it, leaving nothing but trailing sparks of wasted energy. "The Acre!" Elena screamed over the roar of the creature. She realized the Null Wolf wasn't just attacking. It was tethered to the obsidian splinter she still clutched in her hand. "The splinter is its heart, Your Majesty. It's drawing power from the physical plane because the shard is still intact." The king in his wolf form darted back, his golden eyes wide with a frantic, desperate realization. He turned toward Elena, the beast's jaw snapping, and for a terrifying second she thought he might kill her for the chaos she'd brought to his door. Instead he shoved his massive furred shoulder into the doorframe, bracing himself to block the creature's path, giving Elena the split second she needed. "Destroy it," the king howled, his voice a guttural command that rattled the very rafters. Elena didn't have a weapon, but she had the salt solution and a piece of the nursery's ancient iron heating grate. She scrambled toward the hearth, her mind racing. She remembered the old chants from the slum healers, the ones that used heat and iron to bind the volatile. She slammed the shard into the heating grate, the iron glowing a dull red as the fire roared to life. The shard shrieked, a high, piercing sound that made the Null Wolf recoil, its form flickering. It was a race against time. The creature was already beginning to weave itself into the structural foundations of the nursery, its claws tearing through the stone walls like wet parchment. "Mina!" Elena shouted toward the open door, hoping against hope. A moment later, the kitchen girl burst into the room, carrying a heavy brass bucket of blessed cooling oil from the cellar. She didn't ask questions. She saw the king, she saw the monster, and she saw the maid fighting for the heir. She hurled the contents of the bucket into the hearth. The resulting explosion of steam and sacred, ionized vapor filled the room, turning the air into a blinding white pressure. The Null Wolf hit the wall of vapor and dissolved, its substance unable to hold its form against the sudden, purifying change in density. The room fell into an immediate, heavy silence. The only sound was the king's ragged, heavy breathing as he stood over his son's bed, shifting back into human form, his skin covered in sweat and smudges of ash. He didn't look at the ruin of the room. He walked straight to the bed, checking Julian's pulse. The boy's breathing had steadied, the sickly purple pallor replaced by a natural flush pink. The child was alive. Julian turned to look at Elena, his golden eyes now blazing with a terrifying intensity. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and pulled her close until their faces were inches apart. "You just saved my heir," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "But you also just revealed that you know far more about the dark arts than a common maid has any right to know. Who are you and who sent you?" Elena looked at him, her knees shaking, but her gaze never wavered. "I am someone who has been watching the rot in your court for a long time, Your Majesty. And I didn't come here to kill your son. I came here to tell you that the knife isn't just in your nursery, it's in your council." The air in the nursery grew deathly cold as the king released his grip on Elena's arm, his expression hardening into a mask of regal, terrifying focus. "You speak of the council as if they are the infection," Julian said, his voice echoing off the scorched marble. "But I handpicked those advisors. I trust them with my kingdom, with my life, and with my son's future." Elena reached into her apron and pulled out the small leather-bound book she had hidden away, the one she had been keeping for months. She flipped to the final page, where a series of ink sketch sigils were interlaced with lists of names. "You trust them because you see them as loyal subjects, Your Majesty," Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline fading from her limbs. "But you've never seen the back channels. You've never sat in the servants' hall and listened to what the shadows say. Lady Seraphina was only the hand, not the head. Look at these names." Julian took the book, his eyes scanning the pages. As he read, his face drained of color. The names weren't just advisors. They were the heads of the high houses, the families that had built the Lycan dynasty alongside his own. And beside their names, listed in a code he recognized all too well, was a ledger of blood debts. Sacrifices being made to fuel a forbidden ancient power. "They aren't trying to replace me, Julian," Elena whispered, calling him by his first name for the first time, a breach of protocol that somehow felt entirely natural. "They are trying to reconstruct the original hierarchy. They believe the Lycan King has become too human, too focused on mercy and trade, and they want to return to the era of the Blood Throne. They've been poisoning your son not to kill him, but to keep him in a state of perpetual agony, a conduit for their dark magic." Julian's roar was not of a wolf, but of a man who had just seen his entire world shattered. He slammed the book shut, his claws digging into the leather cover until it tore. "They used my own son as a battery," he whispered, a sound of pure, unadulterated, lethal promise. Suddenly, the nursery door creaked open again. It wasn't a guard. It was Lord Alistair, the king's most trusted advisor, the man Julian had viewed as a father figure. He stood in the doorway, his robes pristine, his expression one of calm, detached disappointment. "It is such a shame, Julian," Alistair said, his voice smooth and devoid of malice. "We were so close to finishing the ritual. You were never meant to find out, and certainly not from a servant who should have been buried in the refuse pits weeks ago." Julian stepped in front of Elena and his son, his body beginning to hum with the pre-transformation tension. "Alistair, you were the one who suggested the healers, the ones who have been treating him for months." "I suggested the ones who would ensure the binding held," Alistair corrected, his hand drifting toward a hidden compartment in his sash. Elena realized then that the revelation was not just about the betrayal. It was about the scale of it. Alistair hadn't acted alone. A dozen other figures, guards, noblemen, healers, stepped into the hallway, their eyes glowing with the same violet necrotic light that had infused the splinter. "They aren't just in the council," Elena whispered, her hand moving to the small silver salt flask she still kept in her apron. "They are the foundation of this palace." "Then we burn it down," Julian said, his golden eyes igniting with a lethal, terrifying resolve as he shifted, the sound of his bones resetting echoing through the room. "We burn it all down to get to the truth." The nursery was no longer a room, it was a cage. Lord Alistair signaled, and the hallway outside erupted with the heavy rhythmic thud of plate-clad boots. The royal guard, the very men who had served Julian for a decade, were marching with a singular hive-minded intent. Their eyes, once steady and true, now burned with the sickening violet hue of the shadow binding. "The building is sealed, Julian," Alistair said, his voice cold as a winter grave. "You are not a king. You are merely a host for a transition that should have happened generations ago." Julian let out a roar that wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. He surged forward, a blur of silver-tipped claws and raw, unbridled fury. He slammed into the first wave of guards, throwing them like ragdolls, but there were too many. They moved with the unnatural, disjointed precision of puppets. "Elena, the floor." Julian barked, his voice straining as he held off a spear thrust with his bare arm, the silver tip biting into his shoulder. Elena scrambled to the corner of the nursery, ripping back the ornate rug. Underneath, she had noticed a subtle shift in the floorboards earlier that day. She grabbed the handle of a hidden hatch, the old servants' escape route, a tunnel network that predated the castle's expansion. "Julian now." The king didn't hesitate. He grabbed his son, tucking the small, unconscious boy against his chest and lunged toward the hatch. He threw Elena in first, then leaped down just as the nursery door was splintered off its hinges by a mass of armored bodies. They slammed the hatch shut, the iron bolt clicking into place just as swords hammered against the wood above. They were in the dark now, the subterranean lungs of the palace. It was a network of narrow, suffocating tunnels designed for waste, ventilation, and secrets. "We aren't safe here," Elena whispered, her hands shaking as she ignited a small piece of resin. The flare illuminated the tunnel walls, which were slick with moisture and marked with the same ancient, forbidden sigils Alistair had been using. "The whole palace is rigged with these anchors. Every step we take they'll know where we are." Julian leaned against the cold stone, his breathing ragged. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his Lycan biology working overtime to heal the silver-tipped gashes. He looked at his son. The air was pale, his heartbeat sluggish. "I have spent years building a kingdom," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and utter, crushing despair. "I thought I was protecting my people. I thought I was their shepherd. And all the time I was just fattening them for the slaughter." "You weren't the shepherd, Julian," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. "You were the bait. They kept you distracted with wars and politics so they could weave the threads of the binding right under your feet." A sudden tremor shook the tunnel, a rhythmic, thundering sound coming from above. They were collapsing the structural pillars of the palace, trying to crush the tunnels, and them, into dust. "They're going to bury us alive," Elena realized, horror dawning on her. Julian looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a desperate, final resolve. "Not if we burn the foundation first. If they want this palace to be our tomb, I'll ensure it becomes their pyre." He pointed to a junction in the tunnel, the main line for the palace's alchemy furnace, which supplied the heat for the entire structure. If they could reach the regulator, they could trigger a chain reaction that would melt the very heart of the citadel. But to get there, they had to cross the courtyard of blades, the most heavily guarded section of the basement, where the elite, shadow-bound inquisitors were waiting. They were trapped, hunted, and stripped of everything, with only a maid and a wounded king standing against the entire might of the kingdom. The air in the subterranean tunnels was thick with the scent of ozone and the damp, metallic tang of aging iron. Ahead, the courtyard of blades waited, a massive vaulted chamber where the palace's steam pressurization valves were located. It was the heart of the structure, and it was guarded by the inquisitors, 6 towering, faceless warriors draped in heavy, enchanted robes that absorbed all light and sound. Julian slumped against the cold stone, his breath hitching. The wounds inflicted by the silver-tipped spears were beginning to crust over, but the toxin was still sluggish in his veins. He looked at his son, whose breathing remained shallow and strained. "I can't shift again," Julian rasped, his eyes dimming. "My stamina is gone, Elena. If we walk into that chamber, we are walking into a grave." Elena didn't look at the king. She was kneeling by a junction in the steam pipes, her fingers tracing the intricate, fading brass engravings of the palace's original blueprints she had memorized from the forbidden archives she had pilfered long before becoming a maid. She wasn't just a servant. She was the last descendant of the architects, the guild that had built the citadel before the Lycans ever laid a single stone. "They think this palace is theirs because they inhabit the throne," Elena said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, analytical tone. "But the palace recognizes only the resonance of its own construction. If we can trigger the harmonic frequency of the foundation, the shadow shields won't just fail, they'll shatter." She pulled a heavy wrench from her belt and began tapping the pipes, listening to the pitch of the metal. She wasn't just making noise, she was finding the singing point of the iron. "Julian, I need you to be the catalyst," she said, looking up at him. "You are the king. Your bloodline is the key to the palace's living core. If you place your hand on this valve and feed it your intent, not as a conqueror but as the protector, the building will react to you." The king hesitated, then reached out. As his skin touched the vibrating brass, a low tectonic hum began to ripple through the floorboards. The inquisitors in the chamber ahead paused, their heads tilting in a synchronized, unsettling motion. "Now!" Elena screamed. She swung the wrench with all her might, striking the central pressure valve. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a symphony of destruction. The entire chamber began to vibrate at a pitch that turned the air into a physical barrier. The Inquisitor's shadow cloaks, designed to weave darkness into protection, suddenly inverted. The light that had been trapped inside them lashed outward, blinding the guards and rendering their shields useless. The floor beneath the Inquisitors buckled as the palace's own internal machinery, the very pipes they had used for their shadow rituals, surged with overpressurized steam. The guards were thrown back by the sheer force of the architectural shift, their armor clattering against the walls like wind chimes in a hurricane. Julian pulled his hand back, his eyes flashing with a renewed golden luminescence. He wasn't just a wounded man anymore, he was the master of the house. He looked at Elena, his expression a mix of awe and dawning realization. "You aren't a common maid," he said, his voice resonant and powerful. "You are the lineage of the ones who built this trap." "I am the one who keeps the keys," Elena replied, her eyes set on the shattered doors of the courtyard. "And now we take back the throne." The way was open. The Inquisitors were reeling, their dark magic broken by the very stone they stood upon. They had the element of surprise, the master key to the palace's heart, and a king who had finally stopped fighting his own legacy and started commanding it. The journey through the palace's underbelly was a blur of steam, shattered marble, and the hum of a structure waking up from a long, cursed sleep. As Julian and Elena reached the final staircase leading to the great throne room, the palace itself seemed to bend to their will. The walls pulsed with a soft, golden light, the ancient stone recognizing the blood of the king and the resonance of the architect's descendant. They reached the heavy, reinforced obsidian doors of the throne room. Behind them, the sounds of the palace guard, now confused, their shadow link severed by the harmonic pulse, faded into a distant, disorganized clamor. "Alistair is waiting," Julian said, his voice cold, steady, and devoid of the hesitation that had plagued him for years. He gripped the door handle. "He thinks he's playing a game of chess, but he doesn't realize he's been standing on a bomb this entire time." Julian pushed the doors open. The great throne room was bathed in a stagnant violet light. Lord Alistair stood at the base of the dais, his hands raised, weaving threads of dark energy into a complex, shimmering tapestry, the final stage of the shadow binding. Beside him, a massive obsidian pillar, the primary anchor, vibrated with the weight of 1,000 stolen lifespans. "You're late, Julian," Alistair said, his eyes not even turning toward them. "The binding is nearly complete. Your son's life force is already woven into the structure of the crown. You can't undo it without killing him." Elena didn't wait for the king. She surged forward, her eyes fixed on the base of the obsidian pillar. She saw the weak point, a hairline fracture in the stone that acted as the focus for the entire ritual. "He's lying," she cried out. "The anchor isn't sustaining the boy, Alistair. It's sustaining you. You've been feeding off the palace's life debt to keep your own youth." Alistair turned, his face distorting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He whipped a hand toward Elena, sending a spear of pure void energy tearing through the air. Julian didn't shift. He didn't need to. He stepped into the path of the void energy, his golden eyes flaring as he channeled the palace's own core frequency into his hands. He caught the spear, the void energy hissing and dissipating against his palm like steam on a hot stove. "My son is not a battery," Julian bellowed, his voice carrying the weight of the entire lineage of the Lycan throne. "And this throne is not your plaything." The king stomped his foot, sending a shockwave through the floorboards. The golden light flared from the stone, surging up into the throne itself and igniting the obsidian pillar. The pillar began to glow not with the sickening violet of the shadows, but with the brilliant, searing white of true, untainted royal blood. Elena lunged, plunging her wrench into the fracture at the base of the pillar. The impact resonated through the room, a sound like a mountain cracking in half. The obsidian pillar shattered. Alistair screamed as the feedback of the broken ritual slammed into him. The violet light erupted from his own body, dragging him into the void he had spent decades cultivating. He was swallowed by his own ambition, pulled into the cracks in the floor until only the empty, echoing chamber remained. The violet light vanished. The oppressive weight that had hung over the palace for years evaporated, replaced by a sudden cooling breeze flowing through the high vaulted windows. Julian rushed to the throne, where his son lay curled on the stone steps. He scooped the boy up, and as his skin touched his son's, the golden light of the palace flowed into the child, mending the last of the necrotic damage. The boy's eyes fluttered open, clear, bright, and alive. Elena stood by the dais, her heart finally slowing. The palace was silent, the shadows gone, and the king was cradling his heir, the look on his face one of such profound raw relief that it made her chest ache. The conspiracy was gone, the anchor broken, and for the first time, the king was not a figurehead of a rotting dynasty, but a father and a ruler who truly owned his house. The sun rose over the Lycan citadel, but it was a different dawn than any the kingdom had seen in centuries. The oppressive violet-tinged gloom that had perpetually clung to the high stone walls had been scoured away by the harmonic resonance of the palace's true core. In the courtyards below, the guards, their eyes now clear and golden, tended to the rubble of the throne room, their movements guided by a sense of purpose that hadn't existed while they were tethered to the shadow binding. In the great throne room, the silence was no longer heavy with secrets. It was filled with the soft, steady rhythm of life. Prince Julian was awake, his small hands clutching his father's tunic, his laughter echoing off the freshly cleared stone floors. The agony that had haunted him for years had vanished, replaced by the boundless, untamed energy of a young Lycan pup who finally had his future back. King Julian stood at the balcony watching his people. He wasn't wearing his crown, he had set it aside on the dais, opting for the simple, rugged attire of a protector. He turned as the heavy doors creaked open, revealing Elena. She was dressed not in a maid's apron, but in the structured, practical robes of the royal architects, the garb of the lineage she had kept hidden to survive. "You're leaving," the king said, his voice quiet, lacking the commanding thunder it had once possessed. It was the voice of a man who had been humbled. "My work here is done, Julian," Elena replied, her gaze lingering on the restoration work happening on the fractured marble floor. "The palace is stable. The harmonic frequency is reset. The shadows have no anchor here anymore. You saved my house. You saved my blood." The king stepped toward her, his expression raw and unfiltered. "I offered you a position in my inner council, a seat of power that most would kill for. Why refuse?" Elena smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression that made the scars of the previous night seem like distant memories. "Power is what built this trap, Your Majesty. You don't need a council of peers. You need a kingdom of people who can see the truth. I am an architect. I build foundations, not thrones. My place is out there, ensuring that the next generation of this land isn't built on debts and shadows." The king bowed his head, not to his subject but to a peer who had saved his soul. "Then take this," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out an ancient, silver-etched signet ring, the mark of the first architect. "As long as this ring is worn, you have the full protection of the Lycan throne. Wherever you go, whatever you build, you are never without an ally." Elena took the ring, feeling the cool, solid weight of it against her palm. As she turned to leave, she caught a final glimpse of the king and his son on the balcony, a father and a child looking out over a land that was finally, truly free. The betrayal had burned the old palace down, but from the ashes, a foundation had been laid that could withstand any shadow. She walked out into the bright morning light, her path ahead unwritten, her secret no longer a burden but a strength. The palace was silent behind her, and for the first time in an eternity, the kingdom was breathing, alive and whole. The nightmare was over, and the future was a clean, golden slate. And that, my dear friends, is where our story reaches its peaceful, hard-won resolution. It was an honor to share this journey of redemption, courage, and hidden truths with you. What was your favorite twist in our tale? Was it the revelation of Elena's true heritage as an architect, or the final battle in the throne room? Please leave a comment and let me know. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community for our next epic adventure. I'll see you there.